Alcoholism plus Religion Almost Destroyed My Family by Simone. My story isn't a unique one. I was just another girl in a religious family in a red corner of a blue state. Some of my first memories were driving to and from church, my father's AM radio roaring over any attempts at conversation. My brother, sister, and I were all enrolled in the local K-12 Catholic school, and we were all active members in the church youth programs. It wasn't a bad childhood. On the contrary, to anyone who saw our family, my life looked like a regular Norman Rockwell illustration. However, what lay beneath was a family torn apart and plagued by alcoholism, and a church that prevented us from healing and recovering from it. I think my parents always drank, but I never realized what alcoholism was until I was about 9. I remember the fridge always being full of different bottles and cans that I couldn't drink. I remember starting to notice that my father's post-church beer turning into an all-day event. I remember bottles of wine slowly disappearing over dinner. It wasn't until I started spending the night at friends' houses that I realized it wasn't normal for parents to slur their words or get into fights on a nightly basis. My parents were never abusive. In fact, they were the most loving, caring individuals I've ever had the pleasure of meeting. Unfortunately, alcohol was starting to pull our family apart, and the support system my parents assumed they could rely on fell apart in front of our very eyes. My parents caught my sister drinking when she was 13. I was 11 at the time, and even then I could see the mixture of anger, rage, and guilt in the eyes of my parents. The house was surprisingly quiet that night. My brother and I played Super Nintendo in the living room, my sister was confined upstairs, and my parents whispered to each other about what to do while huddled in the dining room. My older brother, who would later triumph in his own battle with alcoholism years later, comforted his clearly uncomfortable little sister and told me everything was going to be okay. It would be, but we didn't know just how arduous it would be to get there. The next morning, my entire family loaded up into our old Ford Bronco, AM radio blasting Rush Limbaugh, and drove to the church to meet with our priest. He was a longtime family friend and, until this day, had always guided our family down a wholesome and religiously rewarding path. We arrived at the church and sat down in the waiting area of our priest's modest home attached to the Catholic school we all attended. My brother and I lingered awkwardly outside as my sister, mother, and father talked to the priest behind closed doors. Initially, the only audible sound was the radiator clicking on or off. Out of an almost painful silence, the sound of my father's thunderous voice erupted from behind the closed door, followed by the muted sound of our priest's modest, pleading tone. My father again cut him off, and before we knew it, my father exploded out of the door and in one motion swept my entire family into the car and drove off in complete silence. It wasn't until months later that I actually found out what happened, but before that, things started to change in our house. Once filled with beer, the fridge suddenly felt vacant. There were no more wine bottles scattered across the dinner table. No more awkward yelling matches. My sister was still grounded for what seemed like forever, but in time, things went back to normal. Before long, my family stopped going to church, and they found a new school for my siblings and me. When I asked my father why we had to change schools, and if it had anything to do with that day at the priest's house, I got an answer I'll remember for the rest of my life. He told us, "Your sister was a failure in the eyes of the Lord," my father said. My parents had tried to explain that, at least in part, my sister's drinking was their fault, but our priest wouldn't hear it. Instead, he explained that my sister was out of touch with God, and her drinking was a failure in his eyes. The final straw was our priest handing my father a pamphlet for a Christian drug rehab center. My father understandably lost his cool, screaming that if one drink made his daughter a failure in the eyes of God, then so was he. We never went back. This wasn't the last of my family's battles with alcoholism, but it was certainly the beginning of the end. They tried to keep it from us, but my parents and sister would attend sobriety programs hosted in the community center every week. The wine and beer that filled our fridge slowly started to disappear, and the relationship between my sister and parents flourished. After a few years of near-perfect sobriety, my sister and parents graduated their respective programs and never looked back. My parents, now atheists, are proudly sober, along with my sister and brother. My story isn't unique, though. This happens every day. It's an anecdote, but my family was almost torn apart by alcoholism, the church, and the lack of solutions it provided. With secular treatment, my family was able to mend from what would have assuredly torn us apart otherwise. My family may not be a Norman Rockwell painting, but it is beautiful. It was far from easy, but through each other and the secular options my parents pursued, we're better now than ever. About the author, Simone. Simone is a writer, photographer, and film lover living in Detroit, Michigan. She currently blogs about drug and alcohol addiction and how to move beyond them. You can find her on her days off, cooking, playing hockey, or watching Netflix with her cat, Luke Skywalker. To read the original print version of this article, which contains original artwork by Catherine F., and links to references throughout the article, simply go to aabeyondbelief.org and search for Alcoholism Plus Religion Almost Destroyed My Family, dated June 18, 2017. For more stories, articles, and podcasts, please visit our YouTube or SoundCloud channels. Just search for AA Beyond Belief.